The night air was cold and heavy with mist. The wind moved down the empty street, carrying the faint sound of dripping water from the broken pipe. Daniel sat inside his small shop, his hands moving slowly over a pile of coins, counting them again. And again the dim light from the single bulb cast long shadows over the wooden counter and the shelves filled with goods. It had been a long day with very few customers. The town had grown quieter over the years, and people had less to spend. Daniel had learned to survive with little. He had a small home behind the shop and a routine that never changed. But that night, something different happened. A soft knock came at the shop door. It was so light that Daniel almost thought he imagined it. He frowned and turned his head, listening again. The knock came again, this time a little louder, a pause, and then a voice weak and trembling. "Please, I just need a job." Daniel froze. The voice was not like the voices he heard every day. It had a different rhythm. He stood up and moved to the door, pulling it open just enough to see outside. There in the mist stood a thin, alien woman. Her skin had a pale silver glow, and her large, clear dark eyes seemed to reflect the faint light from the shop window. Her hair hung loose and messy, and her clothes were old and torn. Beside her, a small child held tightly to her leg, the little girl looking up at Daniel with fear and hope mixed in her eyes. Woman took a step forward, holding her child close. Her voice shook as she spoke again. "No one will hire me. I just need work. Anything I can clean, I can carry, I can help in any way. Please do not send us away." Daniel looked past her into the street. There was no one else around. The night was too cold for wandering, yet here she was, standing in front of him with a child. No one in this part of the city gave jobs to aliens, especially not widows. People believed they were trouble, useless, or dangerous. The whispers in the market were always the same: stay away from them. They take more than they give. But as Daniel looked at her face, he did not see danger. He saw exhaustion. He saw a will to survive and a silent plea for mercy. He opened the door wider, letting the cold air rush in. "Come inside," he said quietly. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped in, pulling her child along. The girl shivered in the warm air of the shop, looking around with wide eyes. Daniel closed the door and locked it. He moved behind the counter and gestured to a chair. "Sit down," he said. The woman sat carefully, her daughter on her lap. Daniel poured hot water from a kettle into a cup and pushed it toward her. She wrapped her hands around it as if it was the only warmth she had felt all day. She thanked him in a quiet voice. Daniel asked her name. She said her name was Lyra, and her daughter was Sci. They had been moving from place to place for months since her husband had died. She spoke in short sentences, as if afraid to say too much. Daniel could tell there was more to her story, but he did not press her. "Eyes told enough. Why my shop?" he asked. "There are others." She looked down and said, "You are the only one I saw who did not shout at me or turn away. You looked at me like I am still a person." Daniel said nothing for a moment. His mind was thinking of the trouble this could bring. Customers would talk, other merchants might avoid trading with him. But he could not send her out into the cold. He remembered a time years ago when he had been desperate for help and someone had given him a chance without asking for anything in return. He stood and said, "You can start tomorrow." Lyra's eyes widened with disbelief and relief. She nodded quickly, saying, "I will work hard, I promise. Just let me prove myself." Daniel told her she could clean the shop in the mornings and help with customers when it was busy. The pay would be small at first, but it would be enough for food and shelter. Lyra accepted without hesitation. As the night grew deeper, Daniel walked them to the small spare room at the back of the shop. It had been used for storage, but it was warm and safe. He cleared a space and brought in a blanket and a thin mattress. Lyra thanked him again, her voice shaking as she put Saya to bed. When Daniel stepped back into the shop alone, he felt something shift inside him. He had made a choice that would change both their lives. Morning came early, with pale sunlight creeping over the rooftops. The mist from the night before had settled into tiny drops. On the shop window, Daniel unlocked the door to find Lyra already waiting outside. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her daughter stood beside her holding a small piece of bread that looked like it had been saved from the night before. Daniel nodded in greeting and stepped aside, letting them in. Lyra did not waste a moment. She took out an old cloth from her bag and began wiping the counter. She moved with quick, careful motions, as if afraid to miss a single speck of dust. Sci sat quietly on a small stool in the corner, her large eyes watching every movement her mother made. Shelves had not been cleaned in weeks, and the floor carried the dust of many customers, but Lyra worked without stopping. Her movements were steady and quiet. Daniel watched for a while before going to prepare the goods for the day. He noticed how she organized the jars by size and label without being told. She rearranged the baskets so the fruit looked fresh and inviting. She even polished the old metal scales until they shone in the light. As the morning passed, the first customers arrived. Some glanced at Lyra with narrowed eyes. A few whispered to each other. Daniel caught pieces of their words. Why is she here? Does he not know who they are? This will bring trouble. But Lyra kept her head down and worked without looking at them. Her calm made the whispers fade, though the stares remained. Man came in to buy flour, and instead of handing the coins to Daniel, he placed them on the counter near Lyra. As if to test her, she counted them carefully and handed him the right change with a polite nod. The man looked surprised, but said nothing as he left. Daniel noticed the smallest flicker of pride in Lyra's eyes when the shop grew quiet. Daniel brought out a chair for Sile and gave her a small piece of sweet bread. The girl hesitated before taking it, looking to her mother for permission. Lyra nodded, and Sile took a bite, her face lighting up with the taste. Daniel smiled to himself, feeling a warmth he had not felt in years. By midday, the shop smelled of fresh herbs and clean wood. Lyra had found a small vase and placed a few wildflowers in it without asking. The touch was small, but it made the shop feel alive again. Daniel realized that in just a few hours the place looked better than it had in months. As the afternoon came, the bell above the door rang, and an older woman entered. She was known in town for speaking her mind and for disliking outsiders. She looked at Lyra and frowned. Who is this? She asked. Daniel said calmly, she is helping me with the shop. The woman shook her head and muttered about the dangers of trusting strangers before leaving. Without buying anything, Lyra's shoulders sank for a moment, but she quickly straightened and went back to work. Daniel pretended not to notice, though he had heard every word. He understood this would not be easy for her or for him, but he also knew she had already earned her place. Later in the day, a sudden rain began to fall outside. The sound on the roof was steady and soft. Seal moved closer to the counter to watch the drops slide down the glass. She whispered something to her mother, and Lyra smiled for the first time since morning. It was a small smile, but it carried warmth. Daniel saw it and felt an unexpected lift in his own mood. As the day came to an end, Lyra swept the floor one last time, then washed her hands. She thanked Daniel in her quiet voice and began to gather Sial's things. Daniel told her she could leave them in the back room since she would be returning in the morning. She hesitated, then nodded, agreeing to stay in the room again for the night before locking up. Daniel glanced around the shop. The shelves were straight, the counters gleamed, and even the air smelled fresher. He realized that hiring her had not been a mistake. Despite the whispers and the stares, she had worked harder than anyone he had seen in years. That night, as he sat in his small kitchen, eating a simple meal, he could hear faint laughter from the back room. Sile's voice was light and quick. Lyra's was softer, slower, but still filled with a gentleness that had been missing from the shop for a long time. Daniel thought about the next day and the one after that. For the first time in months, he felt curious about the future. The sun rose higher than usual that morning, casting a warm glow over the shop. Daniel had opened early to prepare for the market rush. Lyra was already inside, arranging the jars of spices in neat rows. Sci sat on the same small stool, her little Hands busy drawing on a scrap of paper, Daniel noticed how comfortable they had become in this space, and for a brief moment he felt proud of his choice to keep them. The bell above the door rang sharply, and 3 men stepped in, their voices loud. As they laughed together, one of them noticed Lyra, and his smile twisted into something unfriendly. "Did not know you were hiring her kind," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. His friends chuckled, looking her up and down as if she were an object. Rather than a purse, Daniel felt his jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Lyra kept her eyes on the shelf in front of her, pretending not to hear. The man stepped closer, leaning over the counter to War. "Daniel, you know people talk, right? They will say you are desperate or foolish. Keeping her here will hurt your business." Daniel straightened his back and met the man's gaze. "She works here because she earns her place," he said. "She works harder than anyone else I have seen. If you have a problem with that, you can take your coins somewhere else." The man's smile vanished, and without another word, he tossed a small bag of grain onto the counter, paid quickly, and left with his friends. Muttering under their breath, the tension in the air lingered. After they were gone, Lyra turned to Daniel, her voice quiet. "I do not want trouble for you. If it is better, I can leave." Daniel shook his head firmly. "You are staying. We will handle it together." By midday, whispers had already spread among the neighboring shopkeepers. A woman from across the street came in, pretending to browse, but clearly wanting to see Lyra for herself. She left without buying anything. Later, a young boy delivered a note from one of the merchants warning Daniel that other traders might refuse to work with him if he kept employing an alien widow. Daniel crumpled the note and tossed it aside. He had survived years of slow sales and tough seasons. He was not about to fire someone who had done nothing but work hard. Lyra noticed his expression, and for the first time since she arrived, she allowed herself to meet his eyes for more than a moment. There was both gratitude and worry in her gaze. The afternoon brought a steady flow of customers. Some ignored Lyra completely. Some spoke to her in clipped words. Others seemed curious. One older man even asked her where she was from and listened without judgment. When he left, he gave Saya a small wrapped candy, which the child held like a treasure. Near closing time, Daniel found Lyra in the back room, folding a piece of cloth carefully. She told him she had been thinking of ways to bring in more customers. She suggested arranging the goods differently or offering small samples of dried fruit. Daniel listened, impressed by her ideas. She spoke with quiet confidence, as if she had been planning this for days. That evening, the air outside was heavy with the smell of rain. Clouds hung low and gray. The street was almost empty. Daniel stood by the window, watching the first drops fall. Lyra was sweeping the floor. Sile sat on the stool, humming softly. It was a peaceful moment until Daniel spotted the same 3 men from earlier standing across the street, watching the shop. They were talking quietly to a group of locals. Pointing toward the door, Daniel knew then that this was only the beginning. The decision to keep Lyra would not fade into the background. It would be tested again and again. But as he looked at her, working quietly, as if the whole world outside could not touch her, he felt more certain of his choice. When the day ended, Lyra thanked him as always, but this time there was something different in her tone. A faint trace of trust had formed between them. Daniel locked the door, and the 3 of them shared a simple meal in the back room. The rain fell harder outside, washing the streets clean for the night. Night had been long, with heavy rain tapping against the roof. Daniel woke earlier than usual and moved quietly through the shop, arranging a few baskets of fruit and checking the jars on the shelves. The smell of damp wood still lingered from the storm. Outside, the sky was pale, and the streets were wet with puddles reflecting the morning light. Lyra appeared from the back room, carrying a small folded blanket. Her hair was tied back neatly, and Sile followed close behind, clutching the blanket in her tiny hands. Daniel noticed how careful Lyra was with every step, as if she feared taking up too much space. She greeted him softly before starting her morning tasks, while Sia returned to her stool with a piece of bread. The day passed without trouble, but as the evening came and the last customer left, Daniel heard something from the back room, a faint, muffled sound like someone crying. He hesitated, then walked quietly toward the door. He pushed it open just enough to see Sci sitting on the mattress, holding a worn piece of cloth to her face. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Lyra knelt beside her, speaking in a low, gentle voice. Daniel stepped back, not wanting to intrude, but her words reached him anyway. She was telling Sci about her father, how he used to lift her high into the air and make her laugh, how he would bring small carved toys from the market. When he returned from work, her voice trembled as she said his name. Daniel stayed still in the shadow of the doorway, listening. Lyra explained that he had died in an accident at the docks when a heavy load fell from a human-operated crane the company had offered. No help and no apology. She had been left to care for Sci alone, with no home, no money, and no one willing to take them. Daniel felt a deep heaviness in his chest. He had known loss before, but hearing it in her quiet voice made it different. This was not just a sad story. It was the weight she carried every day without showing it to the world. He realized then that her silence was not weakness, it was strength. Later that night, when the shop was locked and the lamps were dim, Daniel brought 2 bowls of warm stew to the back room. He set them down without a word. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes showing surprise, but also a small, unspoken thank you. Sci took the first bite and smiled for the first time that day. The sound of her soft laughter filled the small room, and for a brief moment, the sadness seemed to lift over the next days. Daniel noticed changes in the way Lyra moved around the shop. She still worked with the same quiet focus, but now there was a faint ease in her steps. Sci began to explore more, sitting by the window to watch the street or drawing pictures of animals and flowers. Daniel found himself looking forward to their presence as much as he looked forward to the days. Earnings. One afternoon, a group of children passed by the shop. One boy pressed his face to the glass and made a face at Sci. She looked down quickly, but Daniel stepped to the door and called the boy by name, telling him to be on his way. His voice was calm, but firm. The boy left without argument. Lyra saw the exchange and later told Daniel she appreciated his protection. He only shrugged, but inside he felt a sense of responsibility growing stronger each day. As the week came to an end, Daniel realized how quickly he had grown used to their voices in the shop. The routine felt natural now, in a way that made the quiet loneliness of before seem distant. He still thought about the whispers from the townspeople, but they no longer weighed on him the same way. That night after closing, Daniel heard Sci laughing again, this time while Lyra told her a story about a garden on their home world, a place filled with glowing flowers that opened only under the moonlight. The girl's eyes shone as she imagined it. Daniel listened from the other side of the door, not wanting to break the moment. He thought about how easily a small act of kindness could become something far greater. The town was alive with color and sound that morning. Flags waved from the rooftops, and the smell of roasted meat and sweet bread floated through the air. The annual market festival had arrived, bringing merchants from nearby villages and travelers eager to trade. Daniel's shop stood at the edge of the main square, and he had decided to set up a small stall outside to draw in the passing crowd. Lyra arrived early, wearing her cleanest clothes. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she carried a basket of goods carefully arranged. Sci followed, holding a small bundle of flowers they had picked from a roadside patch. Daniel noticed the care Lyra had put into preparing for the day and gave her a nod of approval. Together, they set the stall in order, placing jars of herbs and dried fruit where the sunlight made them glow, and arranging the bread loaves in a way that showed their warm crusts. By mid-morning, the square was full. The sound of music mixed with laughter and the shuffle of feet as people moved between stalls. Lyra worked quietly behind the counter, handing goods to customers and offering samples of dried berries. Sci sat nearby, stringing the flowers into small garlands. Daniel was busy greeting familiar faces and making change for sales. The steady rhythm of trade made him hopeful that the day would be good for business. But as the crowd grew thicker, a man with a flushed face and unsteady steps pushed through to their stall. His breath smelled of strong drink, and his voice carried loudly across the square. He leaned on the counter and stared at Lyra with a smirk. "I did not know the festival allowed her kind to sell goods here," he said, drawing the attention of those nearby. A few people paused to watch, curious. At the scene unfolding, Daniel stepped forward, telling the man to move along, but the man only laughed and reached for Lyra's arm. She pulled back sharply, her eyes flashing with fear. The man raised his voice, accusing her of cheating customers and taking work from honest townsfolk. His words were sharp and filled with insult. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd without thinking. Daniel stepped fully in front of Lyra, blocking the man's reach. His voice was steady, but carried enough. "Forced to cut through the noise, you will leave now," the man sneered, but before he could speak again, Daniel pushed him back with a firm hand. The man stumbled, hitting a table behind him and sending a basket of apples rolling across the ground. The crowd gasped, and several people hurried to help the stall owner pick them up. The drunk man cursed, but seeing the anger in Daniel's eyes and the disapproval of those around him, he turned and staggered away, disappearing into the crowd. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered. Daniel could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, and on Lyra. Some faces showed disapproval, but others looked thoughtful, perhaps even a little respectful. Lyra kept her head down and continued her work, her hands moving quickly as if nothing had happened, though Daniel could see the faint tremor in her fingers. The day went on. Customers returned to the stall. Some bought more than usual, perhaps as a silent show of support. Others avoided the place entirely. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. By the time the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, their baskets were nearly empty, and the stall had earned more than he expected for the day. When they returned to the shop, Daniel closed the door behind them and turned to Lyra. She stood by the counter, holding the last of the unsold bread. Ciel was already in the back room, arranging her flower garlands on the small table. Daniel said quietly, "You did nothing wrong today. You held your ground." She met his gaze for a brief moment and said, "Thank you for standing for Melitor." That evening, while Daniel was cleaning the stall boards in the storage room, Lyra appeared with a small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it to reveal a simple meal she had prepared using Melitor prepared. Using Melitor prepared, using Melitor, and said, "They mere Melitor. Melitor.said. Melitor time, wal Melitor, was Melitor. Wal Akela, SHF, Melitor, desiv. We Melitor, S, we sata to me, you so, we sand unsasid with us as. We so guys it sakai to delad kim sin said it's secret is it idly it's it to sick it to bit to bit it is to bit to bit you to data greeted leave it's the net to all we to made but it's this the bit that they gave us be some of the goods from the shop. She placed it on the table and insisted they share it. The three of them sat together, eating in the warm quiet of the back room. Ciel chattered about the music she had heard and the people she had seen, and for a short while the tension of the day faded that night, as Daniel prepared to rest, he thought about the way the crowd had looked at him after the incident. He realized that standing by Lyra had not just been about protecting her, it had been about protecting the values he wanted to live by in a town where many turned away from those in need. He had chosen to do the opposite, and he knew he would choose it. Again, the morning after the festival, the shop felt quieter than usual. The streets outside were still littered with bits of paper and fallen decorations from the day before. Lyra moved about her work with the same steady care as always. But Daniel noticed she spoke even less than usual. Ciel sat by the window, tracing shapes in the fogged glass. While the faint smell of fresh bread filled the room around midday, the bell above the door rang, and a man stepped inside. His clothes were fine, his shoes polished, and his expression calm yet sharp. He introduced himself as Corvain, a businessman from the larger city down the river. Daniel had seen him once before at the market speaking with local leaders. Corvain walked slowly through the shop, examining the shelves with the eye of someone measuring worth rather than admiring goods. He finally stopped at the counter and leaned slightly forward. "I will be direct," he said. "I have heard about the festival incident and about the alien woman. You keep here working in your shop." Daniel kept his face neutral, waiting for the man to continue. Corvin's voice was smooth as he spoke. "I believe in clean reputations and profitable connections. You are a man with a good location and a steady trade. I can offer you a contract to supply goods to my clients in the city. The terms will be generous, far more than what you earn." No, Daniel felt the weight of the words, but also sensed the hook hidden within them. Corvain continued. "The only condition is that you release the woman from your service. Her presence will make certain partners uneasy, you understand?" How these things work? Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. He asked what would happen to Lyra if she left. Corvain shrugged indifferently, saying that her kind always found some way to survive, though his tone made it sound like he cared little either. Way for a long moment, the shop was silent. Daniel thought about the extra money, about the new connections and the growth his business could see. He also thought about Lyra's quiet determination, the way she had faced insults without answering back. The way Ciel's laughter had begun to fill the once empty air of the shop. He saw the image of them walking away into the cold with nowhere to go and felt something in him tighten. "I will not take your offer," Daniel said calmly. Corvain raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps surprised you are refusing profit for the sake of an alien widow." Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "I am refusing to throw out someone who has done nothing but work hard and earn her place here. If that means losing your deal, so be it." Corvain studied him for a moment, then gave a short smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "Very well," he said. "You have made your choice." He turned and walked to the door, leaving a faint trail of expensive cologne behind. The bell rang as he stepped out into the street, disappearing into the midday crowd. Lyra had been standing near the back shelves during the conversation. She stepped forward now, her hands clasped together tightly, her voice trembled slightly. "You refused him for me?" Daniel shrugged, as if it was nothing, but the truth was clear in his steady tone. "You matter more than his money." For a moment she said nothing, then her eyes shimmered with unspoken gratitude. "No one has ever chosen me over money before," she said quietly. Daniel only nodded and told her to get back to work, but inside he felt the warmth of knowing he had done the right thing. That evening the shop closed early. The three of them shared a simple dinner in the back room. Ciel told a story about a dream she had of a big, bright garden filled with strange, glowing birds. Lyra listened and smiled, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder. Daniel sat across from them, feeling the quiet comfort of the moment. Outside, the sky turned deep blue as the first stars appeared. Daniel thought about how easy it would have been to say yes to Corvin's offer, and how empty it would have felt afterward. Sometimes the harder choice was the only one worth making. He glanced at Lyra and Ciel, and knew that whatever challenges came next, he would face them with the same answer. The night sky had been restless with the sound of wind rushing through the narrow streets, and by morning the clouds hung low and heavy. Daniel stood in the doorway of the shop, looking at the dark sky as the first drops of rain began to fall. He had seen storms like this before, and knew the day would bring trouble for the roof, which had not been repaired in years. By midday, the rain had grown stronger, pounding against the roof until small leaks began to appear. Water dripped onto the shelves, soaking a sack of grain and a box of herbs. Daniel tried to move things quickly, but the water kept finding new ways, and Lyra left her work without hesitation, bringing buckets and cloths to catch the leaks. Sia followed, carrying small bowls with determination that made Daniel smile. Even in the middle of the mess, but it was clear they could not handle it alone. Daniel stepped outside to see if anyone in the street could help. He expected closed doors and quiet faces, but Lyra had already gone ahead, speaking to people in the nearby stalls and homes. Her voice was calm yet firm as she explained the damage and asked for help. A few people hesitated, still holding old doubts in their eyes. Yet one by one, they began to follow her back. To the shop soon there were hands lifting heavy boxes out of the way, others climbing to the roof with tools and sheets to block the rain. The sound of hammers and voices filled the air as the small community worked together. Daniel moved among them, thanking each one, but it was clear they were answering Lyra more than him. The same people who once turned away from her now took her instructions and worked without complaint. By the time the rain slowed, the shop was safe again. The roof was patched. At least enough to last the season, the shelves were dry and the goods saved. Daniel stood in the center of the shop, watching as Lyra thanked everyone with a quiet smile. Sile handed out small cups of warm tea to the helpers, and the sight of her shy gratitude seemed to soften even the hardest faces. When the last person left, Daniel closed the door and leaned against the counter. "You managed to bring the whole street here," he said. Lyra shook her head modestly. "I only asked, and they said yes." Daniel looked at her closely. It was more than that. He said you earned their respect that evening. The air was cool and clear. The storm had washed the streets clean, and the smell of wet stone drifted in through the window. Daniel sat with Lyra and Sia at the small table in the back room. He took out a folded piece of paper and placed it on the table. Lyra looked at it with surprise. It was a written offer making her a permanent partner in the shop. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard. "Right, you are giving me part of your shop?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "You have done more for this place in weeks than I have done in months. You saved it today, and you changed how people see it, and maybe even how they see each other. It is only right." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "I will not let you down." Daniel smiled. "I know you will not." Sia clapped her hands in excitement and hugged her mother tightly. Next morning, the shop opened with both names written neatly on the sign above the door. Daniel and Lyra worked side by side, arranging the goods while Sia decorated the counter with fresh flowers. People came in not just to buy, but to talk, to share news, and even to greet Lyra as if she had always been part of the town. The change was slow, but it was real. As the day came to an end, Daniel stood in the doorway, watching the sunset over the rooftops. Lyra joined him, Sia leaning sleepily against her side. The street was quiet now, but the warmth in his chest was steady and strong. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew they would face them together. Sometimes one act of kindness could change more than one life. It could change an entire story from one of survival to one of hope, and it could begin a new chapter for everyone who dared to believe in a Chore 7-part HFY. Story is now complete in your requested style, with each part holding its own emotional hook and flow, so your YouTube audience stays engaged from start to finish.